Has there ever been a movie more deserving of a sequel than Master and Commander? I mean, this movie is just absolutely perfect. You've got Russell Crowe, you've got Paul Bettany, you've got a litany of other co-stars making this movie just absolutely phenomenal. And you catch Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany at like the absolute perfect time in 2003. Crowe's coming off of Gladiator and this huge run of films, Bettany also rising at the time, and they make this glorious film about the Napoleonic Wars, that early opening crawl, that oceans are now battlefields. My God, y'all, what a movie. I freaking love Master and Commander. This is such a kick-ass movie, and I've been dying to talk about it with you for so very, very long. We did this on HATM a couple of years ago, and I've really been wanting to dive into this a little bit. And I got really excited about doing Master and Commander. I was looking for someone who would hopefully want to talk about this film. So I got really excited when the person we speak to today asked if we could do this film. And the person I'm talking about is actually Mary Hicks. And I was going to do this whole illusion. I was trying to record this intro where I was talking about how ships sail at night by the stars and things like that. Because if you know anything about Mary Hicks, she's a star in our field. One of the things I wanted to be able to do for you guys via this podcast is introduce you to other scholars. And if you work in the Atlantic, you already know who Mary is. But if you don't, now is your chance. She is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. She got her PhD from the University of Virginia back in 2015. And she works in the Black Atlantic. She's actually writing this really cool book. It's just about to come up through the Omaha Institute from University of North Carolina Press. And it's called Captive Cosmopolitans, Black Mariners in the World of South Atlantic Slavery, 1721 to 1835. So in this book, she's kind of looking at the history of Portuguese exploration, but she's doing so from the perspective of enslaved and freed Black seamen laboring in the transatlantic slave trade. This is fascinating stuff. We're going to get into this. So I was really excited. Mary loves this movie. I love this movie. I think a lot of you guys are going to love this film as well and talk about this stuff. But we really spent a lot of time talking about her research, which I think is absolutely fascinating to learn about enslavement in Portuguese history, Brazilian history, African history, and how all of these things work together. I had a blast talking to Mary today. I hope you guys can dig it. I hope she comes back because she got so much to say about so many things. I just love talking to her. So I hope you guys like this show. Sit back and relax because we're about to jump in on this. You got Master and Commander next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Hi, Mary Hicks. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to be here.
You're up in Chicago, right?
Yes, I'm here virtually, but I'm based in Chicago.
Okay, how do you like Chicago up there? Well, like, what are you doing in Chicago?
It's a great city. I realized this week that the St. Patty's Day festivities last for about a week in Chicago. So it's like our Mardi Gras. I think that gives you a sense of what the city's like.
Did you ever see Witness? Or not Witness?
The Fugitive.
Fugitive.
Yeah,
The Fugitive, where they do that, right?
Yeah, that's a great Chicago movie. That's like, it's not yet spring, that kind of weather in Chicago, and you're running through the streets if you're a fugitive, except for you just go around and you see all these groups of people walking around the streets wearing green. That's what it's like now.
Do you have a lot of experience running around the streets like a fugitive? Is this a when you're not grading or what?
No, rarely. I was out the other night and it was just to see some friends and go to a movie, and I was just sort of shocked. I was, we're a week away, I think, from St. Patty's Day, but people were ready for it already. So
I think the Chicagoans, or the Irish in particular, they're just ready for St. Patrick's Day anyway. They're like, this is our time. And for the longest time, I thought being from Kentucky, I probably had some Irish ancestry in me. And I was like, always kind of latched onto it. And then I found out that I'm 100% English. Like, we're full on from Manchester area. Like, so I can't even celebrate that at all. I'm like, show up, I'm like, God save the king or something. I'm just, probably not.
It doesn't stop anyone else,
Okay.
Everyone
Good.
Embraces it, regardless of heritage.
Yeah, it's like, imposter syndrome. It's like, and as a scholar, it's something that I should feel very, very comfortable with. I'm actually in my element. I'm totally a fraud. So you're at University of Chicago?
Yes, that's where I teach right now.
For our audience who aren't familiar with your work, like, what do you do?
So right now I'm finishing a book on enslaved and free mariners Most of them are actually born in Africa, and the book is called Captive Cosmopolitans, Black Mariners in the World of South Atlantic Slavery. And it really focuses on Brazil. So that's my area of expertise. But because it's Brazil in the 18th and early 19th centuries, there's a huge overlap with the geographies of West Africa. So it's a truly transoceanic story, and it was an interesting project. I didn't happen on it intentionally. It was just I ran into in the archives these letters written by enslaved seamen, and they were really fascinating to me. And I wanted to follow their stories. And as we'll talk about, I'm sure in this episode, seamen lived really interesting lives. Full of really eventful moments.
These archives you're talking about, like these seamen, they are enslaved as they are mariners, correct?
Yes.
How are they writing? Are they writing in Portuguese? Are they writing in native West African languages? Like, what's the status of like the archive itself? Like, how do you interrogate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when they would write, it wouldn't necessarily be their hand. They would usually be speaking to a scribe who would then transcribe it for them. So what I looked at were a lot of legal records, so legal petitions for freedom, but also wills that they had drawn up before they went to sea. It was common to draw up a will because, of course, you didn't know if you were going to come back. And other kinds of documents in which they tried to articulate, to the Portuguese colonial state what they wanted. And one of the interesting things about sailors is that they are very multicultural in some ways. They're fluid in all these different kind of cultural expressions because ships are multicultural spaces. They're multi-ethnic and multinational spaces. And so even though a lot of the men I study were born in Africa, they then later learned not only their own sort of natal language, but other African languages. They learned Portuguese. Sometimes some of them would learn English if they were on English ships, or French if they were on a French ship. And also, if you go early, sort of back in time before the 18th century, some of these seamen were going to Asia, so they could have learned Chinese.
What are these ships doing? Like, are these fishing ships? Are these just trading ships? Like,
so I write mostly about ships that are commercial, right? So merchant marine ships, but also if you look at the Royal Armada, that also had enslaved seamen aboard those ships. So in both sort of spaces, both in the Navy and in the sort of private commercial sphere, there are Black mariners present.
So I guess my question then is like, how does a ship operate for Black mariners? Is there any sense of like personal freedom on these ships at all? Like, how does this like, not to dive into this, but what's the day-to-day life? I mean, what does it do what's the life like for an enslaved
seaman? Yeah. So that's a really complicated question. And my book is basically about this, right? So what does it mean to be both enslaved and the term I use is cosmopolitan, but you could also say mobile, right? I think that the core of it is that there's a tension, right? Because you don't have total autonomy. You still have to, let's say, turn over a portion of your wages over to your owner. Sometimes your owner is actually the captain or the pilot or even the quartermaster on that ship, and you're there to serve him. Sometimes you are freed, right? Like you can use your wages and the various sort of trading activities you're conducting on these ships to purchase your own freedom. So you become freed, but you're still tethered to slavery in the sense that it's the era of slavery, and everyone who's has Black skin basically is suspected of being enslaved, right? Even if they're legally free. So it's a really complicated and fluid story, right? There's kind of degrees of autonomy, degrees of mobility, and there's also degrees of coercion that can affect your life, no matter your sort of where you were born, no matter your legal status. And so what I try to understand is how enslaved mariners and then sometimes free mariners leverage the opportunities of the sea to try to create some semblance of the lives that they wanted, both at sea and on land. And of course, they're not always successful because they're always subject to violence. They're always subject to potential re-enslavement, even if it's illegal re-enslavement. They're always subject to, just the harshness that all sailors experience, which is that, seafaring is a very dangerous occupation.
It's not unlike actually being a historian now. I think about like the dangers of being at sea. We've got books flying around. My question though is like actually, so, and forgive me because I'm not well-versed in West African history, but I'm wondering, in my own research, when I'm talking about the importation of, say, formerly enslaved Africans and their importation of, say, cattle knowledge into Florida and so forth. Is there a sense of like a seafaring tradition in these West African, in these enslaved West African folks, or how does that work? Or are they having to pick this up on the fly? How do you come to be a seaman?
So it's both. So there is a long-standing aquatic and even maritime canoe. It's mostly canoe-based seafaring tradition in various parts of West Africa. So on the major rivers, so the Niger River, Delta, that area, there's a huge canoe culture there when the Portuguese arrive. Further north, Senegal, for instance, there's also a water culture there. And so the Portuguese, when they arrive, they start to sort of in their minds associate people of African descent with being particularly aquatic, right? Water-faring people. And much the same way, like you're talking about, I think that's a great analogy, how they imagined enslaved men to be particularly effective herders, right? Because of the various pastoral skills that they would have brought from West Africa. It was the same thing with seafaring. And so they saw them as a waterborne people, but then also, the period of the transatlantic slave trade that I write about, the people who are coming across it tend to be quite young, so young adolescent boys. And what happens when they arrive in Brazil is that they're desired because they're viewed as kind of flexible, able to take on new identities, new occupational skills very easily. And so owners buy them specifically to train them in certain occupations and trades. And that happens all the time. So you would purchase a young boy or an adolescent boy, and hopefully through the course of his lifetime, he would make you more money because he had this occupational skill.
And I'm assuming you could rent out his labor, trade that out, and so forth. Am I right on this?
Yeah. So there's a category of enslavement in Brazil called a wage-earning slave. Escravo de ganho is the Portuguese term. And if you were a seafaring slave, oftentimes you would be rented out. So your owner would actually be living in Salvador da Bahia, which is in the northeast of the country, but you would be rented out to travel sometimes, hundreds, thousands of miles away for months at a time on a voyage. And that's how long your labor would be rented out.
All right, I got to ask you now about another form of labor, which is actually your book, though, because you said you are finishing it up right now. Mm-hmm. Like, how's this process for those folks who don't know like the process? Because I'm just now working on submitting my book proposal to press.
Yeah,
how does this work when you're like at the finish line? Like, where are you now? What are you doing?
Yeah, so I'm just sort of like fixing all the things that are a little bit gnarly. It's like that's the end process, and it's exciting, right? But it's also tedious and painstaking because you have your major ideas in place, but really at the end, you're just trying to make sure that you are creating something that people will not only read, but hopefully be moved by. You really want it to speak to the audience, not just at an intellectual level, but at a level of, I feel like I can understand the world through the eyes of these historical actors. So that's a lot of what my sort of edits and revisions have been about, which is to really make the stories that you find in the archives, which tend to be these just fragments, really. Like you get a sort of small sense of somebody's life in this snapshot moment, and to build that out and to make it into a person that the audience or the reader can really engage with and have a sense of that person's humanity and the life trajectory that they experienced. And that's, I think, a big part of a historian's craft, because I think sometimes historians know this, but when you find documents in the archive, they tend to be quite dry. They're not necessarily the most interesting things because they're generally like commercial records, legal records. And so they can be quite formulaic. And then to draw out of that something that really speaks to the humanity of your historical actors, I think is important.
Am I right in assuming that this is a continuation that's based off of your dissertation? Is that correct?
Yeah. So I've been working on this project for 10 years. It's a big chunk of my life.
How does it change? Do you radically change it? Was that a difficult process to kind of go back and dive back? Because you get done with the dissertation, like, fine, I made it across the finish line, and then maybe you take some time off, I don't know, and then you start again, which is
Yeah,
what I'm doing.
yeah. It's funny. I've never talked about this before, so you're the
Good.
first. I'm debuting all this here.
Outstanding. Put yourself right on the spot. Tell us all the things.
Um, yeah, I don't know.
Scare
I
us,
don't know if
Mary.
I don't have super juicy things to say, but I would just say that it changes in the sense that you go back, you do more research because you have all
Mhm.
these leads. Because when you write your dissertation, there are certain loose threads. So you have certain leads that you want to follow up. I did more work to try to follow individuals. So I went back into archive for many years after I finished my dissertation to try to see if I could follow individuals over time.
Mhm.
And I was doing multi-site archival research. So going between Brazil, Portugal, and the UK, it's oceanic stories are expansive. So it requires you to go to archives all over the place. So part of it is archival work. And then reshaping the narrative, I think, was really about trying to get a handle on what I thought that these men could reveal to us about their time period, right? So trying to draw the implications of their story out into something larger than themselves. And that's a lot of the theoretical work that I did, as well as just hopefully it's written better. It's written in a more engaging way. It's written in a way that a broader audience can understand, and not just the people who read your dissertation who tend to be other academics, but, hopefully something that people who are students or even just students of history can pick up and understand and enjoy. So that's a lot of the work that I've done. And I also do think that over time, the story has gotten a little darker. I mean, if I'm honest about it, I think when I was in the flesh of my dissertation, I was just thinking about look at all these amazing things that happened.
Mm.
And not in a celebratory way, because I don't think you can ever write anything celebratory about the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, it's a very deadly and dehumanizing process, but it was not really attending to the complexity of the power relationships that they were a part of. And I think hopefully the major improvement of the book is that I am fully attending to those.
You're absolutely right. I can't imagine. I guess maybe writing it, you're trying to focus in maybe on these threads, that's to give you hopes. Look at the survival or the resilience and so forth. And ultimately, yeah, I guess it's not surprising that a story of enslaved people is not going to be bright and happy. Speaking of not bright and happy, you are also the first person on this podcast to complain about having to go to Brazil, Portugal, and the UK for your profession. So I'd like to go ahead and congratulate you on that as well.
We all have hardships.
I think so, right? I felt like at times when I was finishing up the disc, I was kind of writing it towards my committee, but okay, just get it over the goal. Whatever will get that head nod and approval, then I'll fix it in post, right? I'll work on and I'll make it more my own. Which I don't really know about because you're so much farther ahead than I am. I'm just now starting to pick up where you are, or trying to start to get to where you are. So, all right, people,
you'll get there. You'll get there.
Will I? I don't really. I have to go look for cattle archives in the UK and Portugal and Brazil. That sounds better than where I have to go, which is Gainesville. But all right, people listening here probably want us to talk about the movie at some point in time. So I asked you early on. I was like, hey, you want to talk about a movie? And you were like, then you gave me immediately. You're like, Quilombo, is that correct? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, Quilombo.
Right. And I was like, you said that, and I was like, what's that? And you're like, how about Master and Commander? I was like, oh, I know that film. So why Master and Commander? What's the deal? Is this a thing for you about ships? Why Master and Commander? Why is this a movie that you like to talk about?
I've actually never talked about it before, but
Ooh.
Master and Commander and I go way back. I actually saw it in the movie theater 20 years ago as a high school student. As you can imagine, quite nerdy high school student. And so I liked historical drama in high school. Surprise. And I was sadly, I think one of the interesting things about this movie is that it's a really well-crafted movie and sometimes now recognized as a real classic. But back then it didn't really perform that well at the box office. So I was one of the few people actually in that movie theater. So yes.
Yeah. Well, I was reading I think a little bit earlier today. You're right. It got nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards. Of course, it got beat out by Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, in every single thing that it did. And it didn't perform. And I think for a lot of us, we did this on the Sunday night thing probably a couple of years ago. And the one thing everyone kept talking about is we want a sequel, but it just didn't do well enough. Have you ever taught with this film at all?
I've never taught with it, even though, watching it, I was sort of thinking about how well it does capture that physical environment of the early 19th century ship. And there's a lot of kind of almost ethnographic work in the film. You know, it has this powerful sense of place and time, and everything feels really authentic. And I think that marks it as distinct. So I think you could teach with this, with the caveat that it is still a romanticized characterization of seafaring life.
Have you read the books at all? When you were being a nerdy high school student, were you also reading these books as well, or no?
No, back then I was reading the classics. So I was reading Jane Austen, you know, and seafaring does come up. The Royal Navy comes up in Jane Austen. I was reading things that were about women in the past. So I never read the books, even though some male friends have said they're really great.
All right, so I want to talk to you a little bit. We were talking a little bit about this off screen. There was an article that went around earlier this week that we saw on Twitter. You and I kind of talked a little bit about it, which is like, why do men love this movie? Is this a movie only for men?
Should there be an exception for maritime historians who are women to love this movie?
I read this article. I was like, this doesn't really quite. I mean, sure, men like this, but this can't only be for men, can it?
No. I mean, it is a very male-driven film. All of the characters are men. We have allusions to women. Women are off screen, and they're sort of alluded to, where you see, one of the main characters writing a letter to his sweetheart or his wife. They sing about women in their their sea shanties are all about women. But
you tell me they're sailors.
So the film is really about brotherhood. It's about this idea of fraternity at sea, which also plays a role in my work. So even though way back then in high school, I never thought I would become a maritime historian, it really was a fluke that I wrote this book about maritime history, I still think there's something compelling about that, because it's like, how do people live these really complicated relationships in this environment, this harsh environment of the 19th century sailing ship during time of war? I just think it's compelling.
Absolutely. And, we were talking a little bit earlier. So you take these stories, in a lot of ways, I look at these kinds of things a lot like the archive. And you were saying this a little bit earlier, you don't get a full picture of someone's life very often, unless you're like Benjamin Franklin, who has a lot to say about himself. Otherwise, so in this case, you've got this very small case. And I'm kind of wondering if you can there's no, what you said this earlier, there's no women in this film. So what's the role of women in this maritime world, either in your own research or like in the master and commander world?
So in the movie, I think women they exist as a sort of ideal, this horizon, when we're done serving in the Napoleonic Wars, which are the setting of the film, we'll be returned to our lovely wives and sweethearts. And you do get these moments, like Lucky Jack Aubrey, who's the main character, Russell Crowe. He has this moment where he sees this woman who's bringing them provisions on a canoe in coastal Brazil, actually, funnily enough. And he sort of looks at her and she looks at him. And there's this kind of allusion to the kind of lives that sailors lived in shores and in port cities as being kind of raucous. I mean, that's what they were known for. That was the characterization of sailors, as being men who frequented not only boarding houses and taverns, but also houses of ill repute, prostitutes.
I see you dancing around this. Go on.
I mean, that is all the historical record just really associates sailors with vice. So basically, I think in that moment we see this kind of like glimmer of loneliness, that Russell Crowe's character doesn't show to anyone, because he has to be the commander, he has to be the master. And so I think women represent this kind of horizon of the life they could have had if they're not on these vessels.
What about the woman as the vessel, or the vessel as the woman? We think about vehicles often. People refer to their cars as she or whatever. Or certainly this happens with ships and also the ocean and stuff. What's with the feminization of the ocean?
So that's a fascinating question about how do sailors understand this environment that they're living in. So I think there's several things. On ships, there is this kind of ritual culture around every aspect of seafaring life. And so we see this alluded to in the film with the sea shanties, the songs at sea that I mentioned before, the music. Sailors would also engage in these kind of rituals, superstitious rituals. So for instance, when they cross the equator, every member of the crew would dunk themselves in a bath of water to mark this passage, you're going over this liminal space. And so you have to mark the passage by dunking yourself in and they would all do it. And it's like, it's workmate bonding, right? It's fraternity bonding, but it's also trying to, I think, control the uncontrollable. So we see all sorts of superstition and ritual happening on these ships that are alluded to in the film. And then, the sea is unpredictable. It's uncontrollable. And I think a lot of the film is about, how do you manage being subject to something that you have no control over? And so why is it feminized? I don't know. Maybe they had a lot of uncontrollable women in their lives. Women are elusive. They're mysterious. They're, perhaps uncontrollable in the world of Patrick O'Brien and this film.
What about, are there scenes in particular that this film, like when we're talking about how many times we rewatch this, are there scenes here that come to mind that you have that are favorites, either as a historian or just things that you really like to like fall back and watch? Like if you find yourself, if this is on TV, are you waiting for a particular scene to show up?
The scene that I always remember are the scenes on the Galapagos Islands. I don't know, for some reason, I still remember that from watching it when I was, 15 or whatever. And that was really beautifully shot. And it was such a break from what the claustrophobic environment of the rest of the movie, that it was really interesting and sort of stood out. I also really liked a lot of the storylines having to do with Midshipman Hallam becoming this sort of pariah on ship, which I thought revealed the complicated kind of class and gender politics of the seafaring vessel. So I really like that. And of course the battle scenes they're really good. It's a really well shot war film.
It's beautiful. I love to, I would show it to my classes just mostly, and just to get their attention, because I'm rattling on for an hour every class, and I'm like, "Hey, everybody, pew pew!" And I would show this. I would open a class with the sea battle scenes and talk about life on ship. We got to talk about one scene in particular, which is the amputation scene.
Oh yeah. Well, you said scenes I enjoyed, but yes, I also remember that scene very clearly.
Oh, okay. Thank you for qualifying that. So. Is that accurate for its time? I mean, are there records in the archive that kind of show these onboard amputations? Are they just trying to get the person drunk and then hope they pass out and survive the surgery? What's going on with that?
Yeah, so there is medicine happening aboard these ships. And I actually have a chapter in my book about shipboard medicine, but it's mostly about African medical practitioners, not European. Ooh. But it's the interesting, so the moment I think that or the sort of period in time that reveals is one of the main characters. Stephen Maturin, the surgeon. So he is a man of science. He's a naturalist. He's very learned. So in a way, he's kind of representing the future of medicine, right? And sort of before the end of the 18th century, surgeons aboard slaving ships not slaving ships. I'm sorry, that's my book. Surgeons aboard naval vessels were not really thought of as being sort of more learned or prestigious than any other kind of artisan, right? It was like being a tailor or something. It was not particularly, it was an art. It was something that you had to learn and study over time, but it was mostly through practice. And so what he's really representing is how medicine is becoming professionalized in this era, and that now you have academically trained physicians who actually have gone to receive a formal education in theory and anatomy before they begin to practice medicine aboard these ships. And so he's, they say at one point in the movie, he's not just a surgeon, he's a real physician. And so the idea that he can perform these kind of really complicated surgeries. Surgeons always perform surgeries, but that you can perform successfully these really complicated surgeries at sea. I think he's meant to represent the future of medicine.
Do you see in your own work any sense of knowledge transfer from you just mentioned this West African medical traditions and so forth? Are these people who were enslaving these folks saying, "Hey, that's a good idea"? Are they bringing this, or is there any kind of recognition that these folks have got real intellectual labor here that is valuable? What do we see in the archive?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's very ad hoc medicine at sea, and in Brazil, at least, and on slaving vessels particularly, you would have African-born men performing this role because there was a notion, a kind of theory of knowledge, if you will, that geography and understanding the climate that the patient is coming from was very important to successful treatment. So if you had somebody who was born in Africa who was familiar with tropical disease, who was familiar with what they saw as the kind of constitution of African peoples, they would be more successful at treating the illnesses that they contracted in these like very virulent circumstances. So this idea that only white academically trained physicians are acceptable as medical practitioners really doesn't come until this period that the movie is set in the early 19th century. And then it's a real battle, right? Because, some people, we know this from our own lives. Like sometimes you prefer a doctor or a therapist who you feel like you can relate to. I mean, it's just because medicine is also interpersonal. You want to have a relationship with that person.
I'm kind of wondering, and this may be beyond the focus of your work, but as I was thinking about this film and then also your work and also this whole mess, I was just up in Alabama recently, and there were still statues to like Confederate soldiers and so forth, and the United States were still grappling with enslavement. And I'm kind of wondering if you have any understanding of like what that's like. Does Brazil go through these throes as well? I mean, do you know anything about that as well? Are they still wrestling with this at all? Because we're a hot mess up here. What's the legacy of this enslaved history down there?
Yeah. I mean, I would say the history wars are actually global. So here there's disagreement about how do we frame the relationship between slavery and the sort of founding ideals of the United States? I mean, that tends to be the sort of pivot of all these debates. In Brazil, there are a series of debates. So not very long ago, I think it's been about 10 years, the federal government adopted a law that basically said that all schools, all secondary schools at least, need to teach African diaspora history, as well as indigenous history. So it needs to be part of the mandated curriculum in all schools. However, very quickly this became a political debate, right, in Brazil. And then you have the former president, Bolsonaro, saying that this is wrong, that there doesn't need to be a mandate of teaching this material in the curriculum, even though, over half of the population in Brazil is of African descent. It's the largest Black population outside of Nigeria in the world. And indigenous, portion of the population is quite large as well, even though it's sort of concentrated in a different geography and more in the interior of the country. And so the idea that, that you would just be teaching the Enlightenment to college or to high school students, I mean, it's problematic because it doesn't really represent the population of Brazil. But yes, it's become a political football. And Bolsonaro even, famously said that, Portuguese did not colonize Angola, which was one of its major colonies in Africa and, a source of a lot of enslaved people in the transatlantic slave trade. So yeah, it's become political there too.
I can't help but reflect now. The low-hanging fruit for anybody who's listening is going to say, going to make reflections directly to Florida, where I'm at right now. I can't help but notice or think that Bolsonaro just made an appearance at CPAC here in the United States a week ago, 2 weeks ago, whenever it was recently. I didn't know about his history with history, if you will. So that I guess maybe shouldn't be surprising. Let's talk about your history. And I'm interested in maybe some of the works that influenced like your work. If you can I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you can kind of talk about 3 of your favorite books, things that you've read that really influenced the book that you're close to finishing now.
I would say, one book, I think the fiction book that actually you could make the case that's had the biggest impact on my field of history is Beloved, Toni Morrison. I actually think that if you look at the historiography before and after Beloved, you'll see a sea change, I think, in how people talked about slavery. And even you have, amazing scholars like Adrian Davis, who wrote in a book, Black Sexual Economies, about how seeing Toni Morrison when she was a student, I believe it was at Howard, led her to think about a new language to talk about slavery, because Morrison wanted to get beyond romanticizing slavery in that book. And if you look at Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, which is another very influential book for me, he talks about Beloved as being this piece of writing that combines the almost uncombinable, right? Which is the kind of terror of slavery and the slave trade with creativity with pleasure, with ingenuity, and that, you actually have to bring those thematics together to actually understand the Black experience in the diaspora. And I think, Morrison's work, I think, stands head and shoulders above all others in terms of influencing historians. The Black Atlantic is a great book by Paul Gilroy. People should check it out. Even though, there have been people who've, not recently, but, for many years, sort of critiqued Gilroy for not attending enough to African history. And so I do try to incorporate Africa more into this story of, how do we see the birth of the modern world through the eyes of people of African descent. Another book, I think a fiction book, actually, surprisingly, that has a really interesting take on slavery is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. Some of the plot lines, I think, are pretty clearly like alluding to an idea of slavery, even though it's a futuristic setting, because it's about questions of will, identity, self-consciousness that are brought up by the condition of servitude. So I think that's been influential for me, or I just like to read it, and I thought it was like a really lucid description of the predicament of the enslaved person. Other books, scholarly books, I really love Taya Miles's writing. I think she writes beautifully. My colleague here at U Chicago, Roshana Johnson, has a great book called Slavery's Metropolis about New Orleans, which is another port city in which slavery was really important. And I think that her work has also been very influential for me.
Taya Miles went to Minnesota, so, which is where I went, and good luck to any of us following that. No, I actually try not to think about Taya Miles doesn't I kid, because she's part of the reason why I ended up going to Minnesota, but like, good Lord, just not convinced Taya's human. Like, it's just not fair how good she does what she does. I want to talk a little bit quickly about other movies too, because Quilombo was something that you had kind of brought up that you wanted to talk about initially, and we're talking about slavery, and I thought maybe one of the cool things we might be able to do with this particular episode is kind of introduce viewers to this other movie and why it's worth checking out. So could you kind of give us like a synopsis of this particular film and why you dig it so much?
Yeah, so this film is about the largest maroon community in the entire world, right? So at its height, tens of thousands of people lived in this place called Palmeiras. It was in the interior of Brazil, and it basically existed in the 17th century. And one of the reasons I think this film is a great historical watch is that it captures a certain sensibility about the possibilities of, I think, creating an alternative racial future from the 70s, right? So it's about the 17th century, but it's very surrealist in certain portions. And it's really about this idea of, if you take the quilombo rather than the plantation as the foundation of Brazilian society, can you create this like multicultural society that everyone can thrive in? So to me, it's about 1970s era multiculturalism in Brazil and how like Black radicals especially tried to understand it through the prism of this history of Maroonage and the Quilombo, which is the actual settlement. And it's sort of about Black power, but it's more complicated than that because there are indigenous people there. There are people of European descent in this escaped slaves community. It's a place of African spirituality, of African, kinship. And that's a big part of the story is it traces the passage of power from father to son. And it's also about Black resistance. And I just think it's a really interesting artifact of that era of Black power, but also kind of multicultural utopianism.
When you go to Brazil to go to the archives, are you ever able to visit any of these actual locations where places like in the film at all? Like, how does this affect like your own work?
Yeah, so Quilombos, I know people do research, especially archaeologists, on these sites. They're not easy to find now, but there have been really, really great archaeological studies about them. So we actually know like what they planted. They had relationships with plantations nearby, and therefore they were able to get tools and household goods and so forth. I've never visited those personally. I have spent time like kayaking in Brazil, trying to get like that oceanic view of the coastline.
You can't kayak in Chicago? It's lovely up there right now.
It's not quite as picturesque as Brazil.
Okay, fine.
It's a kayak. So I've done kayaking trips. I've kayaked in Guanabara Bay, which is where Rio is. I've seen the sea turtles and the dolphins, and it's beautiful. It's fantastic. The other places I try to go is, the churches that the mariners that I write about frequented, the neighborhoods, because you can track all that information down in the archive. So it's really special to see something and document and then visit that neighborhood and know, okay, this is where the mariners in the city lived, and it's overlooking the bay, right? So you can kind of have this panoramic view of the water.
I'm meant to ask you then, like, so you bring up religion, like, how is, like, in your own work, how are, like, West African religions, are they making their way on board on ship? Like how is faith practiced by these enslaved folks? I guess just men, right? Or this is only men on board, or are there ever women ever?
So there are women held in the cargo. There aren't women laboring on the ship as mariners, right? They're not part of the registered crew. Religion played a huge role. So there would be weekly mass on Portuguese ships, and sailors would oftentimes pay alms to churches before they left. Again, try to bless the ship, bless themselves before they undertook this perilous voyage. So Catholicism was important, but also West African spiritual practices were really important. And in the book, I talk a little bit about how the kind of cosmologies or way of thinking about the world and the human body and nature that originated in certain parts of West Africa, particularly what's now like Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, that sort of strip of the coast, how they infiltrated Portuguese shipboard medicine, basically.
Master Commander has a whole bunch of fighting in it. Do these ships that are in your book ever encounter pirates? Are they preyed upon by rivals? What's the violence like for these folks living on these ships or laboring on these ships?
So again, I was saying, like at the beginning, this is a incredibly romantic movie, but it does have a lot of visceral shots of people being injured, people suffering horrific,
men
like,
shot by
life-altering
cannon is what you're trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and the splinters. I mean, just the splinters flying everywhere in all the scenes. I mean, that's leaves an impression.
Okay, yeah.
And then, like, you notice they're all scarred and everything, which the actors, they did a good job. So I think that death is the kind of specter of these ships. And I think that tells you something about the mindset that the people who lived on them had to have, right? Which is that this could be my last day. Violence was an omnipresent part of shipboard life. Violence exercised by officers, by superiors and commanders over able or sort of common sailors. And so it was a part of the discipline of the ship. There was also violence if you were taken as a prize, which is the plot of the movie, is attempt to take a French ship as a prize during the Napoleonic Wars, and also piracy, right? And the purpose of piracy was really just to kind of loot and pillage, but it also meant that you could be killed if you stood in the way of that.
Should we have seen enslaved people on board either the English or the French ships during the Napoleonic Wars?
Yeah, both of them would have had enslaved seamen. And if you've ever read Equiano's travels, right, his travel narrative, he talks about being the enslaved servant of a naval captain in the 7 Years' War. So that's one of the key points of his life. And, we just know from the other records, like records I have also seen. So one of the things I research is this British suppression of the transatlantic slave trade in the early 19th century. And on those ships that were part of what was called the West Africa Squadron, there are African sailors, free African sailors serving on them. So it's not only just enslaved, but also freedmen. And they would act as interpreters in legal proceedings. And so there was always a Black presence on British ships and also French ships as well. And, there's a kind of porosity in these spaces because even though the movies is about this kind of like nationalism at sea, Russell Crowe says, this ship is England, right? There is a circulation of mariners, especially in times of peace, because, to have those kind of skills, to be an able-bodied seaman, which was the technical designation, that was in demand, right? And it was hard to actually get people to serve on these ships, hence the need for things like impressment or forcing people to serve, because it's dangerous, it's not paid particularly well, you're away from your family, your loved ones for months or years at a time. So it's not the most desirable profession.
I'm kind of wondering, did you ever watch the series on Stars? Did you watch Black Sails at all?
No, I've never even heard of it.
Black Sails is a series that came out. It was at the same time as Game of Thrones. It's set up as a prequel to Treasure Island. So it is four seasons of showing the rise of Long John Silver, and it's set up the show was set in the Bahamas in like 1715 or whatever, showing how they came to, these wars over the Caribbean and so forth, because they the series paints the Caribbean as this very lawless place where the European nations really don't have a good grip on what's going on over there. So these places really kind of control themselves, but you do see a lot of, African and African descent people on screen and on ships in these shows. So I was kind of curious if you'd seen it or not. I watched it. I actually argue it's actually better than Game of Thrones as far as it's rewatchable. I can't watch Game of Thrones over again. It's too much. But Black Sails I'll watch multiple times. So if you ever get a chance to watch it, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. Or if you just watch all like 40 episodes, you can come back and then we can talk about, Black Sails at that point in time.
So 4 years from now.
Oh, no. Like, I'm going to give you 4 weeks. You don't have anything. All you're doing is grading. I mean, you've got one book mostly done. Did I see you've got a second book on the way already? Is that what's going on with that?
Yeah, I'm starting to work on the next book, which is returning to the project I thought I was going to do for my dissertation, which is about enslaved women. So I'm going back to that topic now.
All right, so you're working on 2 books at once.
Well, yeah, I'm just sort of starting the preliminary research for that one, and just getting a sense of where I need to travel to next.
All right, let me ask you this. Back to a history thing. Master and Commander. Is it a history film?
Ooh. I would say that I knew we were gonna end here. And I sort of feel like the most boring thing historians do for the public nowadays is like fact checking. It's like the thing I think the public wants us for, but no offense to you, Jason, but I feel it's a little boring. But so the thing I would definitely give Master and Commander kudos for is the detail that they really present to the audience about how socially complicated these ships are, right? You have this divide between the officers and the able-bodied seamen, and it's a class divide and it's a cultural divide, right? So we even get the sense in terms of the language and the dialects that they use that the able-bodied seamen are just working class men from England, while the officers who are commissioned are usually from more well-connected, high-status backgrounds, right? And even the midshipmen, so you'd have like a 13-year-old midshipman who's actually commanding this, 45-year-old able-bodied seaman.
That part's so weird to me.
Yeah, but I mean, it's about class, right? It's about how the Navy organized its very rigid hierarchies. On board ships, there are incredibly rigid hierarchies. There's a chain of command. There is penalty for insubordination, which we also see in the movie. And there's some social mobility. So if you became like a sailing master, that could be like you worked your way up through the ranks and you just know how to sail the vessel really well. But mostly, if you end up as a commissioned officer or warrant officer, it's because you come from status. You have they're called gentlemen for a reason, right? And that's a sort of class association. So we see that. We also see that, the men lower down on the hierarchy can also choose not to obey orders. Marcus Rediger has this great term, I think, called disciplinary paternalism, where he says the captain, and I think that the movie does a great job of portraying this through the character of Russell Crowe, Jack Aubrey. You have to be feared and beloved at the same time by your men, or at least that's the ideal, right? And so you get a sense of the complexity of social relations. You get a sense that able-bodied seamen could sometimes push back, refuse to carry out orders. They could be insubordinate. And that was part of the negotiation of living on the ship. And that, commanders could also use violence in order to get able-bodied seamen to do what they wanted. So the complex world of the ship, I think, is really brought to life in that sense. we get a sense of how these like positions are changing. The actual post of master and commander, it's an actual office, is changing at this time too. The thing I guess I would change, or I would sort of critique it now, especially with what we know about seafaring, or have learned about it in the last 20 years, is the ship is not nearly racially diverse enough. It's just, there's a few black seamen, and I don't think anyone have any lines. So even though you get this like running dialogue by people like the steward who cooks the meals for the captain and for the other officers, like mocking basically his social superiors, you get like a kind of counter narrative to the honorable captain image that he's trying to present. But you don't have any sort of racial dynamic happening on the ship. There's no exploration of that. There's no real exploration of a potential queer sexual dynamic that we know was also on ships. All the men are sort of presented as being de facto heterosexual, right?
There's no romance in this bromance?
There's no romance. Even though the man who becomes a sort of pariah on the ship, the Jonah, or the man who potentially causes all these misfortunes to befall his crewmates, is sort of cast as maybe being perhaps queer, or there's a kind of implication of that. And he's ostracized. So it's not really, I don't think it's a very honest reckoning with that part of sailors' lives, their sexuality.
We've talked about this. It doesn't sound to me like there's going to be it sounds to me like the movie is just too expensive to put together to make a sequel. Netflix series? Like, what's the hopes here? Like, would you watch a Netflix series on this? Would you watch a sequel, or are you happy with just the one film?
I think it would be hard to cast actors who actually did justice to the role, as well as I think Russell Crowe was the perfect Captain Aubrey.
Well, you caught Russell Crowe right in his prime.
I mean, there are very few actors who can do, like, this is the movie buff part of me. There are very few actors who can do both these action scenes credibly, and like you totally buy him rushing the ship and, you know, battling it out and getting shot and getting stabbed and not caring and just keep going, with the intelligence. You know, he has like a mind, and he's like one of the few actors who I think you can translate that to the screen. Like, he's thinking, you know, he's crafty. I don't think you can find another actor nowadays who can do it.
I don't think there are many people like Russell Crowe, at least in his heyday, where he would disappear into a role. I watch Tom Cruise. I know I'm watching Tom Cruise, but you know, Daniel Day-Lewis, I forget I'm watching an actor, and I think Russell Crowe, at least during this time period, and also the interplay between him and Bettany. Bettany was like the perfect guy. Yeah. You know, opposite him, it just worked. I understand though that like maybe Maturin becomes like the more of a leading character in some of the later books. I don't know. So I haven't had a chance to read them, but I would welcome, like, I don't know. I want more ship movies is essentially where I'm going to leave this. So, all right, last question. Mary, where can people find you online or in Chicago?
Yeah, so I'm at the University of Chicago, and I also have a Twitter, at Dr. Mary Hicks. I feel a little, I don't know. I'm on there. I post occasionally. It has my upcoming, you know, when I would give a talk, or if I'm at a conference or something, you can come see me, or my publications. I have a few things coming out soon, hopefully. So.
Well, look, I never know how to end these, so thank you so much for being here. I had a chance to hear you give a talk up in Philadelphia recently, and I was just so happy to be able to listen to you then and be able to talk to you now. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it was really fun. And if you find another ship film, I'll come back. I promise.
Oh, we'll do U571. We'll talk about Das Boot. That's a ship. I guess submarines are boats.
Yeah, there's some parallels between this movie and Das Boot. That's my other theory. It's about claustrophobia.
Oh, I was totally thinking when you talk about like the claustrophobic, I was like, Das Boot is the most claustrophobic film I've ever seen in my life. That movie.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about the links between, you know, Portuguese, Brazilian slavery and the Third Reich. Clearly, obviously, now we're just bringing the bar all the way down now. So, anyway, all right, I'm going to stop. Thank you, Mary, so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Mary Hicks, for taking the time to come out and talk to us today. Thank you, of course, to Fletcher Powell, our producer, for making this show run on time. And thank you to you, the listeners, for continuing to come back week after week and sharing and spreading the love for this podcast. We just passed 2,500 downloads the other day. We're about to pass 3,000. We are making headway in some steam, if you will, as we go along. So thank you so much. If you want to learn more about HATM, you can find us on Twitter at #HATM, or you can follow me at Herbert History on Twitter. There's also an Instagram page where I post weekly what film is coming up. So if you look for Historians at the Movies on Instagram, you'll find that as well. We got a website that's coming up. We're redoing it right now, so stay tuned on that. So anyway, listen, thank you guys so much for being out here today, and keep coming back. We're going to see you guys next time. Bye.